I'm Maria, and this is Jane. We are from an architecture practice called Studio Weave in London. Studio Weave is now 7 years old. We are 9 people, and mostly architects. We do quite a range of sort of design projects from small buildings, large buildings, public spaces, art projects, art installations. Once we even design some salt. So we sort of do quite a broad range of things, and we're really pleased to be asked to talk about something that was obviously very important, I think, to everybody here about creativity in the city. And it's really, really nice to be asked to give a talk that isn't just about our projects, but to be asked to try to think about something and try to sort of share our thoughts. So we've tried to figure out what our thoughts are, and we're going to try and share where we are with them, with you. But obviously this is a discussion, and we'd very much like to talk about where we are with these things.
We've been doing quite a lot of public spaces projects, and something we concentrate on is how the space, the city and the area is made up of. In order to design and actually contribute to public life, we thought that we actually feel that it's quite important to understand the area that we're working very carefully. And recently we've been working this area called Croydon in London. It's sort of in London, but not quite in London in terms of how it feels. And that gave us quite a lot of things to think about, because we are actually designing quite a significant portion of the public space in Croydon. Croydon is one of those places always wanted to become a city, but never really managed to become a city. And in UK, it's a very funny understanding of what is a city and how you become a city and how you need to get approval from the Queen and things like that. So we're going to talk about Croydon and how city is not a city, but sort of think it's city. So why did it become a city, and how we go about it.
It's all making perfect sense so far. Okay. All right. So basically, we've been thinking about how creativity is important to cities, and one of the ideas that keeps coming up over and over again is collaboration. The kind of one of the main brilliant things about living in a city is that you're more likely to find people who are like you, people who are like-minded, that you can work with, that you can innovate with, and that's why people flock to cities. That's why sort of creative industries are sort of obviously brilliant in cities. And what we're thinking about a lot in our work is how us sort of designing and creating environments, how we can make those conducive to collaboration, how we can help get those things to help facilitate collaboration, and therefore the kind of innovative creative industries in the city can better thrive. Obviously, this is just a small part. There's lots of very important things that have to happen in order to create an innovative city, but the public realm design and the design of environments does play a key role in that. So, as Jay was saying, today we would like to share with you a slightly strange and interesting story about a place that thinks it's a city, but is not a city. It's not a town that is a big town and thinks that it should have the status of a city. It's not that sort of a place. It's actually part of London. And it's been sort of brought into London as London has grown. It's kind of become subsumed into the city of London. But itself, it thinks that it should be its own city in its own right and not part of London. And the reason that we want to talk about this today is because going through the process of thinking about this, we've had to think about things like, well, what makes a city a city? And what are the key things that this place should improve on or work harder at to make it sort of qualify as a city? And how can our work, which is designing a huge area of public space in the centre of this place, contribute to its goal of becoming a city? And the answer that kept coming up again and again was always connected again to collaboration. And so that's why we thought this was relevant to creativity in the city.
Well, a little bit of a caveat here is we don't think our design would make some place a city. It's a very, very complex situation, economical, social, political situation is very, very complex. And again, a lot of things that we're going to talk about today is pure speculation, come from very thin amount of research, so don't take our word for it.
We're suggesting. Okay, so because one of the important things about considering whether or not Croydon should be part of London or not is to do with the size of London, we just thought we'd put in some nice classic Google Earth images of London and Budapest. There's one missing. And then just one slide for people who don't know London, and this is obviously a very clear explanation of exactly how that city works, so good. Okay, so yeah, I mean, London is huge. Geographically, it's absolutely enormous. And it's only been this huge for about 50 years. The inner, darker green part is the County of London up until 1965. And then in 1965, they changed the way that the governments worked and made Greater London, which is absolutely enormous. And you can see this is St Paul's, sort of centre of London in many ways. And this is Croydon. This is the centre of Croydon. So as you can see, it was sort of a fair way from London. It's 10 miles south of St Paul's, pretty much directly south. But it used to be a sort of place outside of London, and when London grew in 1965, it got just taken in, and this gave it a bit of an identity crisis. If you Google Croydon, which is always a good place to start research, then these are the sort of four main categories of images that will come up. Big, massive roads, and big, massive, scary developments. The 2011 riots, big in Croydon, and trams. And all of these things are quite unusual for the UK. Big roads, I mean, a lot of places in the UK have very small, tiny, pokey roads, and this has, gives us lots of transport issues. Big developments, quite difficult to get through in the UK with a very conservative planning system, lots of conservation areas and things like that. So places that are sort of genuinely trying to do big scale innovative architecture, it's very, very difficult. I'm not saying this is great design, this is a very sort of bizarre thing, and I don't even know if this is going to actually happen or not, but this is probably not. Riots, thankfully, are fairly unusual. And trams are really unusual in the UK. We used to be quite good at them, but now we only have 6 tram networks, one of which is Croydon, and I looked it up, and there's more tram track in Budapest than there is in the whole of the UK. So yeah, we're not very good at trams, but we do like them when we manage to get them through. Not least because we often have very narrow roads, so it's quite difficult to squeeze them in. So yeah, that's an impression of Croydon. Lovely. So Croydon sits, as we were saying, quite near to the south, and actually since 1965 a few changes have happened to this border, and it now comes a little bit further south of the sort of centre of Croydon. But something that's been happening particularly recently, this map was made of the changes in the socio-economic status of various parts of London between 2001 and 2011, which is when we had 2 censuses. Censi, maybe. And basically what's been happening is that the outer London, the places shown in blue here, tend to be going down in socio-economic status, whereas central London is going up. So outer London generally is not really thought of anymore as this kind of wonderful, ideal place where you can sort of live on a lovely tree-lined street and then commute into the centre of London. And that kind of division between outer and inner is falling apart a little bit, and it's changing. So one of the responses to this has been a project called the Outer London Fund, which was initiated by the Mayor of London to help regenerate places that are on the outskirts of London. And this is a map that shows the various projects that have been taking place around Outer London. The main objective, they're mostly kind of public realm projects, but they also tend to work with local businesses and things like that. And it's about kind of regenerating the high streets and town centres in these places that are on the outskirts. We at Studio Weave have been involved with a few of them. The ones with the red circles around are our projects. And then these two red dots are also other outer London projects, even though they're not through the same funding stream, but it's part of the same kind of sort of plethora of initiatives that are going on to try and help outer London improve. Okay, so as Jay mentioned, to become a city in the UK, you have to apply to the Queen. It's quite an unusual situation, I think. There are currently 69 cities in London, and all of them have had to be granted some sort of charter. Some of these sort of are from a very, very long time ago, so the process was different. But nevertheless, you don't automatically become a city because you have a big population or because you have a cathedral or because you have a university or anything like that. There's no specific criteria. You have to put in a bid and sort of work very hard to try and sort of put in a bid to this board. And then eventually, Lizzie will either tell you yes or no. And this is Chelmsford, who are very pleased to have become a city recently. And since 1951, Croydon has applied 7 times and always been rejected. So, poor old Croydon. So, we thought that when starting to work in Croydon, that the fact that they think that they're a city and the Queen and everybody else thinks, no, you're not a city, was quite interesting. And we thought that when we're designing for this place, we need to understand, do we think that it should be a city? Do we think that it should be a city but it's not a city yet, therefore our project should be working towards helping it reach its goal, or what? And if this is a different situation, this is not a town that thinks it should be a city, if this is part of another city that thinks it should be a city, then what sort of qualifies it? What means that it's not just that it's big enough or important enough, it's also that it's separate enough from London as a whole for that to make sense. So we did some research and made some thoughts as to how it might be qualified. Obviously the first one, most obvious one, is population, and Croydon does have a very big population of over 300,000 people, which is more than several other of the 69 British cities, and it's got the largest population of any borough in London, so that was a good start. The next thing we thought was it should be an employment centre. There should be lots of jobs in this place. If a place is generally sort of people are leaving that area and going to have jobs elsewhere, then maybe it's not a strong enough employment centre in itself. So this map shows all the boroughs of London, how sort of the proportion of jobs to the proportion of working age people. So the more orange a place is, the more jobs there are compared to the number of people who live in that borough and could actually work there. So the City of London, right in the middle, that little funny one, has 75 jobs for every person of working age who lives there. So loads and loads and loads and loads of people flock into there. And then the further out of London you get, the less jobs there are. In Croydon, it does okay on this, but there's still a net outward migration from Croydon in order for work. Another thing we thought is, does the name of the borough, is the name of the borough the same as the name of its primary centre? So this was a slightly weird one, but for example, this is the borough of Croydon, and this is the centre of Croydon. So Croydon is Croydon, this is Bromley, the centre of Bromley is Bromley, but other places, for example Havering, the middle of Havering, the main centre in Havering is Romford. So this is a bit strange, but basically we felt that if a place was called by its major centre, then this probably means that this place is thought of as kind of defined mostly by its urban centre, rather than a kind of county, which could be a kind of countryside or something like that has lots of villages and bits and bobs in it. And some London boroughs were just countryside and had a few villages in it, and then eventually they just became sort of suburban sprawl. But places that really were places in themselves and then became London boroughs are a bit different. So this map, all of the ones in dark blue, those boroughs are named after their major centre. The ones in light blue, they're sort of a little bit connected. So for example, Camden, the borough of Camden, the centre is Camden Town, and Enfield is Enfield Town, and the centre of Walthamstow is Waltham Forest. So there's a connection there, but it's not as strong as sort of Ealing is Ealing, for example. It should be a culturally active place if it's going to be a city in its own right. It doesn't do so well here. The dark purple ones are places that people generally go to, lots of museums and galleries and the theatre, and take part in cultural activities. And the medium purple ones, sort of a little bit less, and then the white ones quite low. And yeah, as you can see, kind of the centre of London and going out towards the west, they're sort of quite culturally active. Croydon, not so much really. And then this was quite an interesting one. So there was a survey done about whether people felt that they could get on with their neighbours if their neighbours were from a different background. And cities tend to be diverse places where lots of people from lots of different backgrounds have to live next to each other. So we felt that this kind of tolerance was quite important. And again, it's very similar to the cultural activity one. Sort of, you can see that there's a big swathe here from central to west London, with a few other stand-up places, but further away they sort of struggle a bit. But Croydon does better here. It's a good solid average. So, of all of the London boroughs, we felt that Croydon, which is this one, Bromley, and Ealing could reasonably be considered themselves as cities within London. But the difference is that Croydon has applied 7 times and Bromley and Ealing have never applied. So they obviously don't see themselves as a city. This is actually a map of all of the London boroughs that have ever applied to be a city. Now, the City of London and the City of Westminster have been granted city status, but Southwark, Tower Hamlets and Greenwich applied once each, then gave up, respectfully. Croydon there, obviously, with the 7 times. So there's obviously something about being a city that's very important to Croydon, but it's going to keep on going until eventually it wins, I suppose. So we were thinking about the kind of things that Croydon has done in the past that might make it sort of a city, or at least show its city ambitions. And these are some diagrams that we made as part of our project, but basically thinking about how Croydon has developed its retail centre massively. It's a huge retail shopping centre. It considered itself the second place in southeast of England for going shopping after the West End. And this is a huge claim, and I don't think we agree with it anymore. But nevertheless, it thought that a huge retail centre, that would be very important. And it also put loads into infrastructure. It's one of the only places that actually finished its ring road. You can have huge roads going all the way around it, and things like that. It's got a very diverse centre in terms of lots of things happening next to each other, sort of jobs and homes and everything happening next to each other. And the way that the transport system works is kind of complicated in that there's a pedestrianised centre, and then there's sort of cyclists and larger traffic becomes more and more welcomed. And those sorts of things are important to it. So, beginning our project then, we wanted to ask the question, how can the public realm play a key role in facilitating this collaboration and making Croydon more city-like? And we have a few thoughts towards this.
So, in our practice, the element of play always become a big part of our understanding how we actually operate. It's not just a distraction. Sometimes we speak to the client and we want to consider how you play, and sometimes they take it quite a wrong way. We don't talk about people not working and just doing something else, but it's all the part of activities, a part of play, and how we understand the world. And it's not just idle distraction, but it's very important and functional. And the play is what we believe is the core of the creativity and collaboration and innovation at all ages. And there are informal meetings, as we were saying. The collaboration happens between people, and in order for the collaboration to happen, the people have to meet and have a chance to have a relationship face to face. And small businesses and self-employed individuals work in very close proximity, and very informal hellos in the public realm is became increasingly more and more important, which has been quite pushed away because we're talking about the internet and the mobile phones and all that kind of other means. And pocket spaces, well, in order to make the informal meetings, we require pocket spaces that it's not just a civic space for a certain event to happen, but where people can just come in and have very short breaks. And landmarks. These are not just political statements or just large building and so on, but something that you already recognise when you're navigating a city. Quite physically helps you to locate yourself, identify yourself within a quite large, complex, off-built environment. And activities. There are loads of activities inherently happening in the urban system. When Maria was talking about Croydon during the 70s and 80s, the activities they very much focused on is retail and economic activities. But that's now changing, that people recognise that diversified activities should be encouraged in the city centre. And community custodianship. Again, this is one of another key parts of what we would like to think about when we do a project, is when people have sense of ownership of the public space. It's not just owned and maintained by someone else, most times the government. Then they start to actually look after it, like the people would look after their own gardens, their own living room. And walking and cycling. Again, this is kind of, again, related to the informal meetings and the pace of your living in the city. Past few decades has been vehicle-dominated cities, and where cars has been dominating our city centres. But at least in London now, a huge movement, and not just pedestrianising certain town centres, but encouraging people to cycle and put more bicycle locks in, where your movement is slower, your awareness of your environment is much better than the hidden behind a vehicle, which encourages people to have informal meetings and interact with each other. And greening. Green spaces have a huge emotional relationship with how we interact with a city. I mean, everyone likes plants, everyone likes trees, although not everyone. Yeah, most people. So, for past several projects, whenever you plant something on the street, people instantly love it. Ooh, plants, nice. Apple trees, cool. And it's really, really
This week we had some apple trees stolen from one of our projects. We're very sad. They like them too much.
Yes, emotional. And the cultural events. We've been involved in a lot of event-based projects that encourage people that we would like to think that encourages people to have more sense of ownership of their own space, because this is not just a space that they can just walk past, but they can have their activities that they can enjoy, like public planting, big street parties, and we've done some screenings in strange places.
I should say that one of the things that's come out of the Outer London Fund is that the briefs for designing public spaces has expanded a bit, and one of the extra things that it started to include is actually providing events. So it's not just about the hardware of creating spaces, but also kind of about the software, and sort of starting to show people how they might use this differently. So whether it's sort of organising a huge party, or a sort of special market event, or a big film screening, or some sort of community activity or something. So it actually starts the process of using that space, as well as just designing the hard kind of the paving and the landscape of that space as well. Sure. One of the things that, because many of our streets are quite narrow, one of the things that you really have to fight quite hard for is to spill out space so that shops are able to sort of display their wares in front of them, so that cafes and things can have tables and chairs and things outside. And it's basically a very good way to bring more activity to the public realm, so that you're more likely to be able to be wandering along the street and there you see your friend having a coffee there or whatever. and some projects we've had to work very hard. The bottom right-hand corner is a project where we've had to end up making sort of 60 legal agreements in order to sign off private land into public land so that we can create these sorts of split-out space. This top left picture is it's near our house, but it was just an amazing kind of London moment. It was hot, which was very rare. And this pizza restaurant, there was roadworks going on in front of it, and it just decided that it was going to put all those of tables and chairs outside and actually use the roadworks as a split-out space because all of the cars couldn't come through there, and it was just really showing that there is this kind of hunger to be able to go out and take the public realm and actually use it as a public space. But we'd end on a serious note.
Education, I mean, the diversity of the city that requires multiple activities to happen, and we believe that education is a very important part, and schools and open spaces are all shared with the community, and going to school near your home and the route to going to your school becomes very much part of your day-to-day life, and you grow a sense of your community through those commutes as a student.
But one of the other things, there was a kind of movement of people, educationists, deciding that schools should be out in the countryside because students should be learning around trees and things. That's obviously wonderful, but it resulted in sort of schools in the city centre often being closed and the sites sold and things like that. And the problem with that is that if you don't go to school with your neighbours, you're less likely to have a relationship with your neighbours, and you don't build those lasting relationships that can often lead to some very productive collaborative things, especially when you're trying to maintain local talent, when you want talent that is sort of comes from a place to stay there and contribute to that place. If people are able to maintain those long-term, lifelong relationships, that really helps. But one of the other things that the Outer London Fund has extended and sort of made part of public realm design, which tends to involve working with lots of very small businesses and trying to improve the way that their shopfront works, the way that they kind of display their goods, the signage and things like that. So it's basically taken the site of the public realm from just being a horizontal surface to also the vertical surfaces that enclose that public realm. It's really hard work. We're doing a couple of jobs like this, and it's really difficult because one minute you had one client and now you've got 100 clients, and that's very difficult. But it does have a huge impact on how we are able to really affect those shared environments. Okay, so just to finish, one of the key things that we think is holding Croydon back from becoming a city in its own right is this migration out from work. The map that I showed earlier with the orange parts and the black parts, still mostly there's about half the number of jobs in Croydon as there are working age people. And one of the ways that Croydon might make some small steps towards rectifying this is to encourage people to start businesses rather than just leave and go and work outside, and to have like kind of creative startups for people to work together with their neighbours, maybe people that they've been to school with, and sort of develop that entrepreneurial attitude to become a centre in itself and not just a suburb of London. And obviously we completely understand that this is a very complex social and economic process, and we're just trying to sort of do our bit. But it's very important to this sort of creative and innovative scene that the public realm can help to facilitate this, help to encourage local talent to stay, and to help facilitate that collaborative environment. The end. These are some of our projects. Yeah, this is some of the work that we've done, so you can imagine. Any questions?
Hello, my name is Mariana, and I would like to know how do you do to change the environment, and the city to put those huge and pretty nice things in the middle of the city?
How do we go about it?
Yeah, how to change, because you have small places in the roads and everything.
So often you have to work with local councils and local business owners and local landowners. We do quite a lot of property detective work where we have to find out who owns what, and then it turns out that actually they're sort of living in the Cayman Islands or something, and there's some agent, and we have to sort of find out who everybody is. We have to spend a lot of time talking to people. We've done projects where we've rented a local shop on the street, an empty shop, and then sort of had workshops and activities and try to sort of get ourselves embedded in the community a little bit and sort of find out what needs to be done in that area. Trying to make something that we can raise funding for is obviously, often quite difficult. And we've been involved in the fundraising aspects of quite a lot of projects. Although there are a lot of our projects are publicly funded, so funded through schemes like OLF, which is the Mayor's Regeneration Fund, Transport for London, sort of often a source of money, because if you can improve the way that transport works for pedestrians, for buses, for cyclists, and things like that, then that ticks certain boxes, and you can sort of get funding through that. But it involves talking to lots and lots of different people, I think.
Well, also the UK is in a slightly funny position with their planning laws and how the public has quite a huge power to stop the work from the beginning, and often that unfortunately result in just doing exactly the same thing again and again and again, because if you try to do something slightly different, that's where the creative tensions and all the rejections and things begins. The only way to resolve it is really you have to talk to people. And that's why we spend huge amount of our time. Sometimes not paid for. I don't know why we do.
Sometimes it is paid for.
Well, yeah, sometimes it is paid for. Yeah. But in order to change that kind of attitude of being safe, you have to convince people all the time and prepare for some time you might lose.
Marcos. My question is that what would be the exact benefit for the locals if they become a city? Croydon become a city.
That is an excellent question, with no very clear answer, unfortunately. Basically, if you are granted city status, you can call yourself a city. It's very funny. It's just the kind of prestige of that. So, for example, Reading, which is a town to the west of London, has applied a few times to become a city and also been rejected. And so it's given up and it's just calling itself a city now. But everybody knows it's not true. And it has city centre on its buses and things like that, but it's a lie. And now you all know that too.
Well, another part is it's really about the sense of place and the pride of your public space, and everyone obviously attacks themselves where they come from. I'm pretty sure most of you love Budapest as much as we love London. So if your place is called a city and there's some status, that all comes together. Yes.
If it depends on other things that special building issues or roads or community affairs, why do you do these activities? Why don't you lobby I don't know, in a social field for that? To become Croydon as respectful or whatever.
I think there are loads of ways to achieve that, and as I said from the beginning, what we do is a very small part of the makeup of what place become city or not. Obviously there are loads of other people working in different areas. For example, they do a lot of events in Circle Square that recently has been made by a developer. It's actually operated by a developer. It's private, but they opened up so people can have bake-offs and they can operate markets and things. It happens left, right, and centre. It's that we were giving an example of what we can do as, architectural designers or architects.
All right, thank you.
So that agent was shortlisted for Autodeskian Architect of the Year Award 2014, and it's just about 4 finalists. And I think, in a small article about you, it was mentioned that you was shortlisted probably. Your project is distinguished, but great contribution to public demand. And that's also from one side, you just architects who are building creative city for people, but on another side, you're also creative yourself. And you mentioned in your presentation, like it's important, like collaboration and like interaction, and like you mentioned example, like for children go together to school. And for example, when you in a business, and you know what's important of creative districts, for example, you know, and how in London this collaboration working in your experience. Always like interaction, you know, where you do your practice.
For example, our office is at this place called Dalston. It's uber trendy, hipster-filled area.
Because we are so trendy.
Because we just are. It's quite funny. Whatever we say to people, so people ask, "So where is your office, Dalston?" Their reaction is instantly, "Oh, of course." You know, it's like we all have these circles of people, you know, the graphic designers, architects, artists, fashion designers, writers. They all sort of hang around in the same sort of bars and same sort of party, and we're ending up knowing each other, all have babies and things. Anyway, so it's like it's that kind of very fundamental friendship, and just collaboration is not, you don't have to just go someone like, I want to work with you. That is one type of collaboration, but you just become friends with these people that do a lot of creative output, and just having a conversation in a bar and just being in the same area and sharing same ethos at some level. That's very much a big part of the collaboration.
Yeah, I mean, we've within London we've collaborated with brilliant kind of diversity of people, from sort of like historic carvers to dancers, choreographers, writers, lots of craftspeople and fabricators, graphic designers, and a lot of, like, when you find these people, it's not a very formal process usually. It's usually that you've met someone down a pub, or somebody's sort of seen you at another event, or it's like dating really. It's like except not internet dating. It's more like old-fashioned dating, I suppose. And if you have a creative region where these sorts of people tend to flock, and I don't think you can create that on purpose that much. It sort of has to work because rents are cheap and there is just a kind of critical mass of people. Then that can naturally happen, and that's really, really fruitful.
And also because architecturally, when we work, we require loads of other disciplines, like engineering, quantity surveying, and client have a multiple stakeholder, and they all become part of collaboration. And they are in, again, different districts. There's like Structure Engineers Row in the middle of the Westminster, where all the structural engineers somehow ended up in the same street. So you kind of get in there, and then you kind of work your way through. So it's kind of helpful when we are kind of segmented in a different part of the city.
Directly compared.
Yeah.
So do you think it's possible to build like a creative district on purpose, or it just happens?
No, you can't do that. I just don't believe that.
No, I think you can do things to help. The sort of some of the things that we were trying to talk about. I think you can enable things, facilitate things, help them to be environments that are conducive to that. But you can't create it from above. It's too complicated.
Yeah, and I mean it's really funny, and also these. The term is awful. This creative industry. Yeah. Anyway, as soon as developers and like government intervene and try to make that area of some kind of reason, they run away. It's like in East London, the Shoreditch was a dump like 15 years ago, and then all artists moved in first, and then some nice corner shops and bakeries and coffee shops started opening up, and all the young creatives went there because rent was cheap, and and everyone hung around a similar place, and they like to be thinking they're edgy and live in a rough area. So that happened, and now developers starting to capitalize in that kind of vibe because it became a fashion. And the rent is going up, new offices getting built, dressed like warehouse, but not a warehouse at all. And then all of them just went to Dalston,
And then now Dalston, I'm pretty sure within the next 5 years will become exactly the same as that, and people will move to somewhere else. So if you know where they're going to go next, you'll be a really, really rich person.
Maybe it's a purpose to make this situation more.
Yeah, you mentioned in your presentation that you have to collaborate with many people and in groups, and you also have to collaborate with the government since some of your projects are publicly funded. So your projects are not really, they're a little bit one of a kind. So sometimes they're playful. For some people they could be too playful. So how can the government cope with that? How can you convince them they're working?
I don't really know. I think you should ask them.
Well, I guess the first you really have to convince them this is buildable. A lot of times that they're worried about the budget and the time frame they have to deliver, and often if you have a conceptual understanding that you have no idea how you're going to build it and what impact it would be, you can't convince them because you're just saying, isn't this pretty? So we spend an awful lot of time the technical resolution of a project and how it has a wider impact, and try to have far more comprehensive report on how our project will contribute towards a certain problem.
Yeah, I mean, we know what they're going to say. They're going to say that, someone's going to set fire to it, somebody's going to kick it and it'll fall down, so pigeons are going to poop all over it, that, it's going to be graffitied, it's going to, all of these things. So when we're preparing our designs, we think about, okay, we know what they're going to ask, what are our answers? Have we designed it so that it's going to be strong enough? Sometimes once we put in a plastic owl so that the plastic owl scares away the pigeons, so that the pigeons don't poop in it, and all of these things, so that then when they're worried about all of those functional problems, which I completely agree with, these are important things, we have the answers prepared, so then they can't say anything really.
Yeah, and also a lot of our project, the parts that we really like, ending up to be, because to resolve technical and bureaucratical challenge, like how do you put on the colour, what are they called, the colour contrast for the visually impaired people. So when we're doing a project in City of London, there are 4 posts. It's timber posts. It's quite big timber posts. Unless you're completely blind, you will see something is standing there. But the health and safety guideline requires to make a visual contrast, and normally they translate into the white circular dots just across if you look at like windows and things. And we're like, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to go for a full screen print and go make it, the best version of yourself, rather than just satisfy ourselves that we passed the legal side of it.
So it ended up red and blue and gold.
Gold. I like that.
Yeah.
Do you think gold makes a building or a product or anything lovable, or what could make it lovable?
I do like gold. I think, but also that sometimes architects like things only because non-architects don't like them, and gold often falls into that category, I think. We try not to fall into that trap, although it's difficult with your education sometimes.
Well, I mean, everyone has their obsession. You just need to think about whether that's appropriate or not. Because when you're doing architecture, you're not designing for yourself. You have to constantly remind yourself you're not designing for your bathroom.
But you do have to be careful with precious metals, obviously. I mean, to clarify, the gold is actually brass.
It's Dutch gold.
Dutch gold. We do have to worry about things being stolen quite a lot. And if you use, we've done a project that's clad in a copper aluminium, which is the same gold colour that makes the Euro points. And you have to make sure that things are fastened on properly. We were looking at using lead for a project, but we can't because it's just going to be stolen immediately. So that's an issue.
So if you're not designing for your own bathroom, who do you design for? How do you picture those people or group of people that you design for?
Well, again, if we're designing for someone, we have a few private clients, and that's quite different dynamic because they have quite clear direction. Although I can't say their direction is always right. So we often try to have a quite long conversation with them to find out who they are first, because often they go to the conclusion before they actually think about what their requirements are. So it's kind of different dynamic, but fundamental understanding is saying you're not designing for yourself. You are actually working with this person and have to respond to their need. Obviously, they are coming to us to make a certain judgment, whether it's aesthetic or material, but essentially you have to understand someone else will be using this day to day, not you.
I would say one of the key tricks of working for the government, working for kind of public clients in public spaces, is that you give people a way to describe the project that they can then tell somebody else easily. If the way you describe your project is very complicated and sort of academic and intellectual and sort of difficult to remember, then the politicians and the local council officers and things, they can't tell somebody else why this is a good idea. And normally when you present a design to a big panel of council officers or something, they're going to have to go back and tell their people and their bosses and their maintenance people and everything. So you need to give them a story that is easy for them to tell. Which is why sometimes we do literally write once upon a time stories, because they're easy to remember, and it's easy for somebody else to then tell somebody else, and not totally lose the meaning.
I find it amazing on your website that each project has a narrative next to it. And this is what I was going to ask. Why is it important to have a narrative? But now I understand. So thank you. And what is your favorite project? I mean, is there any?
Why do people always ask us that?
I know it's but
so mean. It's the one we're going to do in 50 years.
Yeah.
My favourite. I love that one. It's brilliant. It's so good.
Give me more coffee.
Couldn't possibly answer. I'm sorry.
I know it was a stupid question. I have my favorite project from you. And actually, can I ask a question about that? The Lullaby Factory. This is that I really like the fairy tale next to it. Also, did you write it or is?
Yeah.
Well, Lullaby Factory was a very strange project. The architects.
Maybe I'll point to it if we get back on. Will it come back on?
Yeah, just
there's a hospital complex called Great Ormond Street Hospital. It's a world-famous children's hospital. Because they have a large estate with a lot of buildings, they kind of build every building in like 15 years rotation. And they just recently built a new building which has designed to be looking towards to this beautiful landscaped plaza.
It's this one.
In front of it. But unfortunately, because the area to become a plaza, but currently another building is occupying. So this building is designed to look at this backside of this old building for next 15 years. So unfortunately. So they held a competition, and we were only architects. It was all artists have been asked, and we somehow won. And because it was the backside of the building has loads of servicing pipes, everywhere, all sort of plant, whatnot, and we didn't want to hide it away, and we want to use that as a very mechanical, very factory-like. And it is actually like a factory. And what does this factory make? That was our pretty much first question, and I can't remember how we got to it. It became Lullaby, and then we decided, how does one make a lullaby? What kind of ingredient would we need to make a lullaby? And then we started inventing all the machineries. We basically had a factory blueprint, how the ingredient get mixed, and all the processes were described through narrative, and we just designed that to...
And this was a collaboration with a composer who actually composed the lullaby, and we worked together a lot on sort of the kind of processes and the names of the processes and things like that, and she used a lot of those words in the lullaby as well. So.
Thank you very much for coming, and I think it was a very inspiring presentation, I hope, for others. history, and I hope you enjoy your time in Budapest. Thanks for coming.